The story opens on a dark and stormy night as the three members of the White family relax inside their cozy house. Herbert White and his father, Mr. White, are playing a game of chess, while Mrs. White is knitting a woolen cloth near the fire. After quite a match, when Herbert wins, Mr. White, his father, starts complaining about the terrible, terrible weather and nearly deserted road they live near. Mr. White, the father, says, "Of all the beastly, slushy, out of the way places to live in, this is the worst. Pathways are hog, and the roads a torrent. I don't know what people are thinking about. I suppose because only two houses on the road are let, they think it just doesn't matter." Waiting for a friend, he adds, "I don't even think he's gonna come tonight." Quite then, the gate banged loudly and heavy footsteps came towards the door. "There he is," said Herbert White. "A family friend, Surgeon Major Morris, arrives for a visit." The Surgeon Major shook hands and, taking a seat by the fire, watched contentedly while his host brought out whiskey and tumblers. Over whiskey, Surgeon Major Morris starts telling his stories of his exploits abroad and what not. Mr. Herbert interrupted and said, "Well, I did like to go to India myself, just to look around a bit. I should like to see those old temples and fakirs and jugglers, you know. Um, by the way, what was that you started telling me the other day about monkey's paw or something, Morris? Do you remember?" Hearing this, Morris startled a bit, but due to Mr. and Mrs. White's urging, Surgeon Major Morris took out a small mummified paw out of his pocket. He explains that a fakir plays a spell on that paw to prove that people's lives are governed by faith and that it's very dangerous to play with faith. He explains that a fakir plays a spell on that paw to prove that people's lives are governed by faith and that it is very dangerous to play with faith. The Surgeon Major Morris added that three men can wish on the paw 3 times each, and that he himself has already had his 3 wishes, as has another man, who he claimed to have used his third wish to ask for death. The Surgeon Major told that he has considered selling the paw, but he doesn't want it to cause any more trouble than it already has. The Surgeon Major throws the paw into the fire. Seeing this, Mr. White quickly rescues it, saying, "If you don't want it, Morris, just give it to me." The Surgeon Major warns him 3 times to leave the paw alone, but then he eventually had to explain how to make a wish on the paw. After dinner and more tales of India, the Surgeon Major leaves the house. Before they all went to sleep, Mr. White took the paw from his pocket, stared at it, and said, "I don't know what to wish for, and that's a fact. It seems to me I have got all I want." Herbert, his son, then interrupts, saying that £200 would enable them to pay off the money owed for the house they live in. Hearing this, Mr. White looks into the paw and says distinctly, "I wish for £200." Herbert then accompanies him with some melodramatic chords played on the piano. After Mr. and Mrs. White goes to bed, Herbert sits by the fire for a while, and while doing so, he suddenly sees a vividly realistic monkey face in the flames. He then immediately puts out the fire, takes the monkey's paw, and goes to bed. It's the next morning, a sunny winter day. The room seems cheerful and normal in contrast to the previous evening's gloomy atmosphere, and the mummified paw now looks harmless. Mrs. White comments on how ridiculous the Surgeon Major's story was, but remarks that 200 pounds couldn't do any harm. Now, after breakfast, Herbert then leaves for work to his office, Moore and Megan's. Later that day, Mrs. White notices a stranger outside their house dressed in nice clothes. The stranger hesitantly approaches their gate 3 times before opening it and coming up to the door. Mrs. White finally ushers him in. The stranger steps in and says, I was asked to call. I come from Moore and Megan's. Mrs. White started. Is anything the matter? Has anything happened to Herbert? What is it? What is it? Her husband interposed and said, there, Mrs. White. Sit down and don't jump to conclusions. You've not brought any bad news, I'm sure, sir. And he eyed the visitor wistfully. I'm sorry, began the visitor. Is he hurt? Demanded the mother. The visitor bowed in assent, said, badly hurt, but he's not in any pain. She broke off suddenly as she realizes that Herbert feels no pain because he's dead. She caught her breath and turning to her husband, laid her trembling old hand upon his. There was a long silence. The visitor, in a low voice, says, he was caught in the machine while working, and before we could do anything, he was crushed to death. He then explains that the company will not take any responsibility for the death, but will give the Whites 200 pounds. Hearing this, all the conversations and the wish made to the poor about the 200 pounds flashed before Mr. and Mrs. White. Mrs. White shrieks, and Mr. White faints. In the huge new cemetery, some 2 miles distant, the old couple, Mr. and Mrs. White, buried their only son Herbert, and came back to a house steeped in shadow and silence. It was all over so quickly that at first they could hardly realize it, and remained in a state of expectation as though something else to happen, something else which was to lighten this load too heavy for old hearts to bear. A week after the burial, Mr. White wakes up and hears his wife crying by the window. He gently urges her to come back to bed, but she refuses. He dozes off again until Mrs. White suddenly cries out that she wants the monkey's paw. She came stumbling across the room toward him. I want it. I want it. You have not destroyed it, right? I only just thought of it. Why didn't I think of it before? Why didn't you think of it before? The other 2 wishes? We've only had 1 wish till now. We're left with 2 more wishes. To this, Mr. White demanded fiercely, was not that 1 wish enough? No, she cried aloud. We'll have 1 more. Go down and get it quickly and wish that our boy be alive again. The man sat up in bed and flung the bed sheets from his quaking limbs. Good God, you're mad. But we had the first wish granted, didn't we? Why not the second? Said the old woman. It was just a coincidence, stammered the old man. Go and get it and wish, cried the old woman, quivering with excitement. The old man turned and regarded her, and his voice shook as he said, he has been dead 10 days. And besides, I would not want to tell you, but when we went to get his body, I couldn't recognize his face, or even his body. I could only recognize him by his clothing. It was too terrible for you to see back then. How would he be now? Just imagine. Hearing this, the old woman cried and dragged him toward the door. Do you think I fear the child I have nursed? Mrs. White continues to insist on wishing Herbert back to life with the monkey's paw. Mr. White finally retrieves the paw from its place downstairs as Mrs. White orders him to make the wish 2 more times until his son finally comes back. Mr. White makes the wish, and as they wait, the candle goes out. They hear the clock, the creak of the staircase, and the sound of a mouse. At last, Mr. White goes downstairs. His match goes out, and before he can strike another, he hears a knock at the door. Another knock sounds. Mr. White, scared to death, rushes upstairs. Mrs. White hears the third knock and says, "It's Herbert. It's my boy. It's Herbert." "What are you holding me for? Let go. I must go open the door. It's Herbert." The old man, trembling, cried out, "For God's sake, don't let it in." The old woman cried out, "You're afraid of your own son? Let me go." Mr. White begs her not to open the door, but she breaks free and runs downstairs. As she struggles to reach the bolt, the knocking becomes more insistent. Mr. White then searches frantically for the monkey's paw, which had dropped to the floor, so that he could make one last wish to restore everything to normal. As Mrs. White pulls back the bolt, Mr. White finally finds the paw and makes a final wish. The knocking stops, and Mrs. White cries out. Mr. White dashes downstairs, and a cold, cold wind rushed up the staircase, and a long, loud wail of disappointment and misery came from and then to the gate beyond. The street lamp flickering opposite shone on a quiet and deserted road. Mr. White murmurs, "Thank God."